So, hey everyone, if you don't know me, my name's Kat Murthy. I'm Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, or SSDP. We're the largest national network of youth-led working to end the war on drugs. And this year, we're centering cannabis justice in all of that. Because while you would be forgiven in many states for believing that marijuana is now legal, it's still not. We have a whole lot more work to do and a lot more to fight. Just last year, over 250,000 Americans were arrested on marijuana charges, 92% for possession alone. We have close to 3,000 federal prisoners serving long-term sentences, some of them close to life sentences, some of them life sentences for amounts of cannabis less than dispensaries deal with on a daily basis. And across the country, we have tens of thousands of people either behind bars or still bound by the paper shackles of a criminal record because of cannabis. And so there's a whole lot more to do here, and that's why I'm so excited. I'll be seeing so many of you in a week. It's just a week for our 420 week of unity here in Washington, D.C. We'll have 3 expungement fairs. We're speaking on panels. We're going to be participating in a number of different things. We'll have a vigil for victims of the war on drugs, and right at the center of that, we're going to have a massive lobby day. It's the largest ever coalition, bipartisan coalition of organizations and individuals working together on cannabis justice. And we're coming to DC to ask for 3 things: cannabis descheduling to get everyone out of prison on who's there for cannabis charges, and to clear records. And there's a reason, though, that we have centered cannabis. It's not all bad. There's actually a lot of opportunities right now. The White House has signaled that they're very interested in this issue. And it's also a huge year for cannabis on Capitol Hill. There's so much different activity going on. There's so many different approaches and potential pieces of legislation being discussed. It's kind of hard to keep it straight. There's not just one marijuana legalization bill. There's tons of them. And so I'm so glad that we have here with us today Sonia Norton. Sonia is the Senior Legislative Assistant for Congressional Cannabis Caucus founder Earl Blumenauer, who's been one of our biggest congressional allies when it comes to cannabis justice. And today she's going to be outlining for us today the lay of the land when it comes to cannabis in Congress ahead of our 420 week of unity next week. So when we go to Congress, when we go to the Hill, we're going to have a really full understanding of the larger context of our work in marijuana reform, what the opportunities are, and what we still need to do. And so thank you so much, Sonia. I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And just a quick disclaimer for folks, my comments today are reflective of my personal opinions and are not to be attributed to the congressman or our office. But so excited to be here with you all. As Kat said, my name is Sonia Norton. I'm the Senior Legislative Assistant for Congressman Blumenauer, who serves on Ways and Means and Budget and is one of the founders and current co-chairs of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. This is a huge issue for the congressman, and I've been here with him working on this for about 2 years, but on the Hill about 5 years. But yeah, we can dive right in, and then I'm happy to answer questions, and definitely let me know if I say something that doesn't make sense or speak in Hill acronyms, as I tend to do sometimes a little too much. But basically, for folks who are newer to the congressional side of this, the Congressional Cannabis Caucus is a bipartisan platform that the congressman created to really bring members together and staff together to learn and brainstorm and think on doing better in cannabis policy. Obviously, cannabis prohibition and the failed war on drugs have had devastating effects, continue to have devastating effects, and we needed a space to come together and do briefings, have discussions, really pave the path forward together. And that's produced a lot of really incredible partnerships and also advanced some really key priorities. The caucus itself doesn't endorse specific legislation, but has really been the foundation for a lot of that work. But the congressman also has some really interesting, I think, issues on the table this Congress that are have a really good chance, even though we have a pretty hostile legislating environment, I'll start with some of the incremental, the smaller pieces of legislation that would still have a huge effect and I think are very much on the table this Congress, and then move into more of, like you talked about, the scheduling review, descheduling piece and comprehensive reform. So one thing I think to really keep an eye on for folks who are interested on the veteran space and the medical cannabis side of this is we have the Veterans Equal Access Act, which is basically legislation, we call it the lowest common denominator, to allow VA providers to give recommendations, references, or complete forms in compliance with their state's laws and their best recommendation. So it doesn't force providers to recommend medical marijuana. It just allows them to give their honest opinion in complete forms so that we're not forcing vets outside of the VA to get the care that is available to other patients in their state. And that is something that we have pushed as a standalone. It went through committee in the 116th Congress, has passed as an NDAA amendment last Congress, and last year passed on the House floor as an appropriations amendment for Milcon VA on voice vote that was introduced by Congressman Brian Mast, Republican from Florida, together with my boss and our fellow co-chairs. Again, passed on voice vote, passed in the Senate, but was stripped in committee. And so we're pushing that again this year, but that's something that I think is in a surprisingly good position and is something that would make a huge difference for those patients that it would affect. We also have, of course, the Safe Banking Act, which would basically end the cash only status for state legal cannabis operations, allowing folks to access banking services through just depository institutions. And this is something that is a huge deal for public safety and for really normalizing the way that we're treating state legal cannabis. It's a huge priority for my boss, something that I've put a lot of work into this year, and we really appreciate all of the outreach that folks have done on this call and in the space to make sure that we're keeping this bill moving. For folks who've been tracking a little bit longer, know that the House has passed this legislation 7 times, and the Senate has finally come to the table in a meaningful way. Passed it out of committee for the first time this Congress, and is still something that Senate Majority Leader Schumer continues to include in the list of bipartisan priorities that hopefully we are in a good place and would love to see continue to move this Congress, and are definitely working on that. We also have appropriations, which is how we fund the government. And we've got a few kind of the classics cannabis provisions that we push for and that are included. There's the Blumenauer-McClintock language, or Blumenauer-McClintock-Norton Lee, sorry, and that is language to prohibit DOJ from using funds to prosecute those who are in compliance with their states or tribes' cannabis laws. This is something that would be expanding an existing provision. So under current law, and since 2014, we have language that prohibits prosecution of medical marijuana, or of those who are in compliance with their states or tribes' medical marijuana laws, but we want to expand that to adult use as well. And that's the core of the Blumenauer-McClintock language that we are pushing. And if that's something that folks are interested in helping circulate or or remind your members to sign on to, I'll put my email for folks to reach out as well. And then we also have that vets equal access provision. But then these are all, I think, crucial steps in service to what we ultimately need: descheduling marijuana, removing it from the Controlled Substances Act, and finally allowing it to be legal and regulated in a sensible way, not just based on stigma, the way that we have under the CSA. And there's a few avenues to do that. We've introduced the MORE Act together with Ranking Member of Judiciary, Mr. Nadler, with Congresswoman Lee, and a couple other incredible co-leads and strong Democratic support. The MORE Act for us is the golden standard for descheduling and would essentially normalize the way that we are regulating cannabis outside of the CSA, while also investing in communities that have been targeted in discriminatory enforcement of the prohibition, and expunging records. A key piece here, especially as you're thinking about coming to the Hill and talking about clearing people's records for offenses that never should have been on there in the first place, is that as there's the administration looking at rescheduling, descheduling, we've seen clemencies from the Biden administration. Administrative action can provide clemency, but they can't do expungements the way that Congress can. And that's a core provision of the MORE Act, is making sure that we're expunging people's records for eligible cannabis offenses. And then, of course, want to touch on the administrative scheduling review that is ongoing. As folks probably know, HHS recommended in August to DEA that marijuana should be moved to Schedule 3. This is the first time that we've seen that level of recognition for the accepted medical use of marijuana in the United States, which is long overdue, very common sense, but historic nonetheless, and a huge step forward. And we are continuing to work on trying to get the rulemaking out of DEA and get their final decision so that we are hopefully at least getting cannabis or getting marijuana out of Schedule 1. My boss, together with many great advocates in Congress, has been leading the way, pushing the administration to fully deschedule, which is the most appropriate scheduling of marijuana, is to completely remove it from the CSA altogether. We think it's significantly less harmful than other substances that are not scheduled, and never should have been scheduled to begin with. However, if we get Schedule 3, there are still significant victories there. It's not Schedule 1, it would reduce some penalties, though not enough. And it would have a huge effect for state legal regulated cannabis businesses by removing marijuana from 280E, helping make the legal market more competitive with the illicit market and more profitable in the way that that other legal and regulated businesses are. So those are kind of the big issues that we're looking at. Lots on the table, lots that can still get done this Congress. And yeah, happy to answer questions, talk to folks about what you're thinking about coming to the Hill.
Well, I'll start. And folks have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can come up and ask as well at the mic. But when we're looking at this, how many, I think this is just a simple question, but how many different bills are we looking at right now? Because I think that's something that's really confused people between SAFE, SAFER, COCA, MORE Act.
So many. I don't have a count off the top of my head of all of the marijuana bill related bills that have been introduced this year. But I think the core in terms of feasibility this year, we're looking at a smaller handful around safe banking, or SAFER if you ask the Senate, veterans equal access. And hopefully also in the safe banking discussions, we've seen reporting, and we're hopeful that we could include things like the HOPE Act, which would support states in providing or in their processes for expungements, and is a huge criminal justice reform piece that we would like to see move with the Safe Banking Act. But yeah, in terms of a number, there's I think a handful that are very feasible this Congress, but there's definitely a lot of bills. For us, the MORE Act is the primary, like the gold standard for comprehensive reform. It's the only piece of legislation that has moved in either, or that has passed in either chamber of Congress to remove marijuana from scheduling. And so I think that for us is the core, at least on the House side, the core legalization bill. Yeah, and then if folks have questions on like specific bills, or if there's more clarification that I can provide there, let me know.
Yeah, definitely. You probably know SSDP and SSDPers came out pretty hard in support of the MORE Act when it was first introduced. And of course, it's back up again now. What are our chances looking like, and what are the changes that have happened in between the two versions?
So this Congress, not great. We've got Chairman Jim Jordan in charge of Judiciary, and if a bill were to go through his Judiciary Committee, it likely would not come out looking the way that we want it to, or actually helping the people we want to serve with legalization and with reforms. And so this Congress, it's very important that we're continuing the momentum, continuing to show kind of unified support for legalization and kind of common sense, kind of normalizing the way that we regulate cannabis, while also, again, showing support for the criminal justice provisions and the investment in marginalized and targeted communities that we see in the MORE Act. So the Texas Congress is the same as passed the House, the previous Congress, but does not have a great chance of getting to the floor in a way that would be productive for the movement.
Okay. Thank you.
However, that'll hopefully change next Congress.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's really going to be helped by our students and everyone else who's coming out to the Hill and really showing that this is a priority. And we hope changing kind of the national narrative around this, where so many people already think that, cannabis has been legalized, this issue is done. And so kind of recentering and making sure folks understand, no, there's a lot of work still left to be done. And,
Mhm.
the majority of people want it. We just need to get it there, right? Um,
Yes.
and I think that that point is an interesting one. The majority of people do want this. This is a bipartisan issue. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but could you talk about that a bit? The fact that the
Yes.
bipartisan element of cannabis reform now.
Yeah, so I mean, the parties are definitely in different places on it, but there's been such great progress, I think, especially with our Republican counterparts. The caucus has 4 co-chairs, 2 Democrat, 2 Republican. We work with Congressman Joyce from Ohio and Congressman Mast from Florida. And everyone, I think, comes to the issue with different priorities and different messages for why they're involved, but especially as folks are thinking about like Republican engagement in the space, finding the connections, whether it is that polling that it is incredibly popular that we've seen Ohio legalize now, hopefully Florida in the fall, but also the connection to veterans and folks who want to make sure that veterans have the best treatment options available. Cannabis is one of those treatment options that is too often denied because of federal prohibition, and that's something that can bring people to the table and making sure that we're doing better for our veterans. There's the research side. We worked together with Congressman Andy Harris, who is not it's supportive of cannabis legalization, but recognize that we need more information about how cannabis impacts the human body, and the need to make it more feasible for researchers to actually do the studies that people want, that we need to move forward with things like an impairment test and other provision or safety provisions, things like that. So we worked with him on the first federal standalone cannabis reform to be enacted since the CSA. That was our Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act that President Biden signed in 2022. But again, like we have very different views on cannabis legalization, but can come together on the need for more information. Like finding those ins has been very beneficial. And I think we're seeing things really change, especially with new generations coming to Congress of members who, like you were saying, people assume it's legal or have seen that the prohibition and the messaging that got it to be prohibited is outdated and doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. I think at this point, everyone knows someone who has consumed cannabis more so than in previous generations and knows that it's not this like fundamentally evil
It's
boogeyman, especially,
certainly.
and we've seen more research on the narrative around gateway drugs. It's been so helpful. And I think that's also like to touch on SSDP's unique contributions here. Like when students who are studying this, researchers and just young people can come in and um, remind members and staff what reform should look like and that it is still needed and still urgent, is very, very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge element. I don't know if you can comment on it, but certainly the fact that we're going into an election year and, this is an issue that young people do care about. And I think if we go out there and communicate it to folks, that's something that matters to folks on both sides of the aisle. And,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen that the polling numbers are clear that it's Republican support legalization, Democrat support legalization, everyone does, but especially young people do. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got some potential for real movement there.
Mm-hmm.
I see Angelie Spence has a question in our chat. She says, I wasn't aware there was such a vast majority of bills about the topic. This is very new to me. Do the people of those bills work together in a way, or are they all separate but related? It's kind of
It
uh,
varies from bill to bill, but we try to work together as much as possible. If you look at sponsors and co-sponsors, it tends to be like we try to work together really cooperatively on that. There are definitely themes. The cannabis co-chairs and my boss tend to be leading most of them, but there's definitely we've seen them from a pretty good spectrum of Democrats and specifically, but also we've seen a growing number of Republicans introducing bills on this that are, I think, productive and helpful to be part of the conversation.
Thank you.
I think that was Angeli. Um, Thanks for the question. Yeah, if anyone has more questions, please pop them in the chat. Definitely excited to have this chance to talk with Sonia. So tell us a little bit more about the cannabis I'm sorry, the Cannabis Caucus itself, because I think that that's something really unique and really cool that's happening there. And it's not something that really gets as widely reported outside of like policy circles or, Politico, things like that.
Yeah, so it was founded in 2017. Before that, my boss had the Cannabis Working Group, which is now part of the Cannabis Caucus events. But we host monthly events and sometimes, like as needed, we'll do additional resources or conversations. But addressing kind of key topics in the issue and information to make sure that people are well informed in Congress, that members and staff are keeping up with kind of key changes or the nuances. Like cannabis can be assumed to be a pretty small or straightforward topic, but it touches everything, like we've seen with all of the bills that are on the table, from financial services and banking to vets to healthcare to research and science, and so much more. And of course, criminal justice reform. And so it's really like we want to be a resource for people so that folks can stay informed in a way that is feasible with so many issues in front of Congress, and coming together in a kind of off the record bipartisan fashion has been very helpful. And then we also have those quarterly cannabis working group meetings for advocates and staff to come together and raise issues and presentations, kind of make sure that we're all in the loop about what's happening in the movement, priorities from different groups, or if there are new groups coming in, new characters, that we're all kind of at the table together and thinking through this in a productive way. It's definitely, there's a really fun press conference from when it was first launched in 2017. We've seen the chairs evolve, but again, my boss was one of the founders and really, really proud. I think I've seen it be a very helpful resource here in Congress for people to know who to go to with questions as they're thinking about new bills or thinking about new avenues. There's just like such good institutional knowledge we really try to bring to the table and have available for folks that are newer to the space.
That's fantastic. What's some of the issues that over time you've seen kind of shift? Like what's the focus or the interest on certain issues?
I mean, bringing criminal justice reform front and center is something that, of course, like has been part of the discussion, but really has come into focus, I think, in a beneficial way, in a way that it should have the whole time, with the introduction of the MORE Act and the passage of the MORE Act and kind of that as a focusing point. And definitely, I mean, just the openness to research, getting our research bill across the finish line was a huge step forward versus if you look back over like the last 10 years, even talking about getting hemp researched before legalization was a big deal like 10 years ago, but something that my boss was still pushing on at the time. I mean, it's across the board. Like the fact that people know there's a cannabis caucus and are willing to come and engage on this issue, that CRS has put out, the Congressional Research Service has put out multiple resources for staff on what would Schedule 3 mean, what is cannabis. Having so many people, even just in Congress, know the difference between hemp, marijuana, and cannabis is like surprisingly recent, but I think a very productive development that people are aware of how it touches so many issues, and that it's something we should be thinking about as we're doing all sorts of reforms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first got into the cannabis space in 2007. I joined an SSDP chapter in 2009. So it's been quite a while, and it's incredible the conversations we were having then and then in the last like 10 or even 5 years, how it's just blown up the interest and
Mm.
the amount of movement that you see on the Hill. So that's
Yeah.
incredible. I see a question here from Kyle. I don't know if it's Jager or Jaeger, so I apologize, but he says, what's the latest you've heard about the status of negotiations around SAFE in the House? Is it your understanding that outstanding issues like Section 10 have largely been resolved? And I'm going to ask you to take a step back as well for folks who aren't necessarily as well versed, and tell them what is SAFE and what are the Section 10 issues.
Yeah, so the Safe Banking Act is legislation that my boss leads with Congressman Joyce, together with our Senate partners, on allowing state legal cannabis businesses to access banking services through depository institutions. So opening a bank account, being able to use like not operate fully in cash, essentially, like having access to basic banking services for the first time. And as a public, it's a public safety concern. It's a just like feasibility of these businesses concerns so that people aren't having to pay their taxes in like tremendous amounts of cash, so that people aren't having to like make sure that consumers are bringing in more cash than people really should be required to carry around. But yeah, it's our banking reform bill, banking access bill for cannabis businesses. Section 10 is around some of the like security concerns and reporting concerns with DOJ and or Department of Justice. And for Kyle's question, I think it's like in a relatively good place. I'm a big fan of knocking on wood and continuing the work, but generally feeling positive.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kimberly, I'm seeing you raise your hand. Feel free to turn on your mic and come to camera if you'd like to ask.
Sure, thanks. Harmless shout out to Rutgers Law School. I took a course at Rutgers. They had a certificate program in cannabis business.
I apologize, Kimberly. You've accidentally been muted. If you could unmute yourself again.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I kind of, oh, thanks. Sort of making my way around that as I try to like sort of, I'm looking at folks in like transitional skill sets and institutions are really like, I know everyone probably is really nervous of, taking on sort of the educational realms of things. Would we see, is there any policy, let me back on my question. Would we see with maybe perhaps rescheduling some of these, not only just public, but private institutions to take on some educational things in the industry that people need?
That's a great question. It's Schedule 3 would be, or this sort of move for Schedule 3 with the existing patchwork of state frameworks, is pretty unprecedented. So a lot of that is just educated sort of not somewhere higher than I guess, but essentially like the biggest changes we'll see with Schedule 3 is it loosens up some of the restrictions on research. So hopefully we'll start to get more information there that would feed into the sort of education that I think you're talking about, and also allows or makes it easier to do the FDA approval process because it would legalize FDA approved drug products that are derived from marijuana. But it also has limitations, especially around criminal justice reform, because some of our laws and those penalties are written specific to marijuana as a scheduled substance rather than like specific to Schedule 1. So they would move with marijuana to Schedule 3 potentially. So they're definitely, I mean, as things play out, as we see kind of what it looks like in practice, I think you're right that there is a lot of need for education, and that's something like that we want to keep talking about, and where groups like this are so important. But hopefully like the availability of more research will filter into a more, I think, productive education for folks on what it does, again, for the human body as something that you're consuming, and also for what the law is, and making sure that people know kind of what it does allow, things like 280E deductions. So letting businesses, state legal businesses, deduct their federal tax expenses, or federal taxes when they could deduct their business expenses, but also the limitations that this doesn't mean you can suddenly assume it's totally legal under federal law. But if I'm missing a part of like the education side of that you're getting at, definitely let me know.
No, just say thank you for that. Just to clarify, and just thinking we would see probably the more updated research first, followed by, is that kind of,
that's I think one
right?
of the biggest benefits of Schedule 3. In terms of chronology, it very much depends. Drug approvals have a wide variety of expenses and timelines, depending on, again, existing research, the sort of investment we see in developing those. Yeah, it's hard to say exactly the chronology of like different like
Right.
implementation there.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to ask about something that I'm pretty sure is not on the table and is a bit of a third rail issue, but as the executive director of a youth-led organization around drug policy, I think it needs to come up. And so we've pegged cannabis legalization for the most part in terms of age to 21, so that it's similar to alcohol and increasingly tobacco in certain states. And obviously no one is making, well, we're not making the argument that, you know, we want children to have access to drugs. And I think that that's why we do this way. We are kind of thinking about this. But then I'm also looking at research from around the states that shows that when we've had adult use only legalization, this is of course the state level, not the federal level, but I'm kind of curious what the thought process is at the federal level as well. When we have adult use only legalization, arrest rates go up for youth versus and so does sometimes depending on the state use as well. But decriminalization has reduced arrests for youth as well, and does not lead to higher rates of use. And so you know, this is state level data that I'm now trying to impose on the federal framework. So I understand the difficulties of that, but I'm kind of curious, you know, how much of it is a third rail to talk about these age restrictions, and you know, is there an opportunity to talk about this just in terms of what can we do to make sure that young people aren't getting pushed into the criminal justice system and getting sort of diverted from many of the opportunities that we know they need to be able to build a successful life for themselves?
That's a great question, and honestly something I should be thinking on more. I think you're definitely right around the sensitivity of like when it can be perceived as allowing kids to, or like children, minors, the younger people, to access drugs. However, I think there's really strong consensus that there should be more safety provisions and just like information in terms of labeling practices and making sure that consumers know what they're consuming. I think no one wants someone accidentally, especially children, to accidentally eat something that looks or is marketed as a candy or a normal just sort of sweets. And so making sure that there's the sort of safety precautions baked into this sort of thing is something that has broad support. We want to make sure that folks know what they're consuming. And then definitely there's more divergence, I think, around what then people should be able to use around intoxicants. But yeah, it's something that's a really good point and something I should think on more.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate
Sorry
it.
for the hard questions.
No, that's good.
So if anyone else in the audience has more questions for Sonia about the state of cannabis legalization on the Hill, whether there's movement on certain things or certain issues, please feel free to pop them in the chat or just raise your hand if you want to come to the mic. But yeah, I really appreciate you being here, Sonia. I think that there's been a lot of movement, a lot of stuff happening. What do you think are the issues that are most likely to really have that consensus behind them moving forward?
I think this year we're looking at safe banking, hopefully. We're looking at the vets equal access piece through hopefully appropriations, but allowing VA providers to complete forms, give references and recommendations in compliance with state law, and looking to the administration for the scheduling review. So that's less something that would be talked about on like in a Hill lobby day, but I think those are the top three issues that we're going to see moving, continuing to move this year and to keep an eye on.
Fantastic. Thank you. And where can folks who want to learn more about this, where can young people who want to get involved in these issues, who maybe want to, you know, go past a lobby day and maybe get involved, like go work on the Hill, work in the Cannabis Caucus, what what advice would you have for them? What can they start doing?
Yeah, for working on the Hill, there's lots of, I think, exciting opportunities for folks who are still in school or even recently graduated or looking for a transition. Internships are a great opportunity. I think there's summer, like throughout the year, summer is the busiest time, but definitely we have internships with our offices, with other offices. So take a look at your members or a member that you would be interested in. Their website usually will have information on that. And then for the like full-time staffing jobs, definitely again, like talking to like the staff assistants and folks who are like building connections on the Hill is really helpful. But we also have sorry, I was going to say the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, but we don't have them anymore. There's on the Senate side, the Senate Office of Employment does like resume reviews and different resources. And then the Majority Leader's Office, and it moves with Majority Leaders, has an initiative that can help do reviews for people, and then we'll give references. Offices can reach out and say, hey, like we have this position open, do you have candidates? And they keep a resume bank to connect folks with that. And then there also are the Congressional Staff Associations for, and particularly the I know Congressional Black Associates, the MNASA, the Middle Eastern North African Staff Association, and a couple others maintain resume banks as well. And so if those are groups that apply to you, they accept resumes and will help flag them for offices as well. The Women's Congressional Staff Association that I'm on the board for also has a job bank. So rather than keeping resumes and sending those, we'll like flag jobs that people or openings that people have sent to us. But I think the biggest thing is continuing like to build connections. Like when you're on lobby day, ask folks and reach out for coffees. This is a place that like runs on these casual conversations so that people can hear what you're interested in. You can hear advice from people because there's a million different paths to the Hill. No one does it exactly the same way. I think internship to staff is the most common route, but it's far from the only one, especially for folks who are a little later in their careers.
So outside of office staff, what else can people do if they want to get really involved in shaping cannabis policy?
That is such a good question. And there's, again, so many routes to do it. I think being involved in your SSDP chapter is a great start. And then looking at organizations, there's for more left-leaning folks, there's the Marijuana Justice Coalition, the group of organizations that are very involved in this. And I think good folks to look for the Marijuana Freedom Alliance for,
SSDP is
yes.
one of the founding members of the
Oh,
MJC.
perfect. Amazing. And yeah, for more Republican leaning folks, there's the Marijuana Freedom Alliance, another group of similar coalition of organizations that are really invested in doing better in the space, and folks to look at. And yeah, and I think if it's something like for researchers, we definitely always, I know like I get questions and we need stats, we need polling to show people quickly. We need those like one pagers, and especially like SSDP folks, I think are really well positioned to be the folks that we come to say like, hey, like someone sent me like all of this data, like what do these numbers mean? And so bringing those skills of kind of where research meets advocacy, and knowing that like while we want to spend so much time and like really get into the weeds, sometimes we just like have to keep running and like take a number with us quickly and learn things very, very quickly. And so being able to provide that information, those resources is very helpful for supporting like the momentum, supporting the advocacy that we need here in Congress.
Great, thank you. And just one final question. What advice would you have folks, all of our citizen lobbyists who will be coming to Washington, D.C., many of whom I think might be going to the Hill for the very first time?
Amazing. Welcome. Hopefully it's lovely weather like we've got this week. As staff, we can't tell people how to lobby, but I think just like bringing an openness to hear when people agree with you. Oftentimes after these lobby days, I'll hear from friends across the aisle, like, hey, I like wanted to tell this like group that was talking to me about cannabis that like there's this opening that like we agree on this thing, and they like wouldn't let me tell them. And so like let them be willing to hear where people, and even Democrats, like where we agree and go from there. I think that like being willing to like see each other and have an actual conversation as much as there's room for is always very helpful, and is part of like how the Cannabis Caucus has been helpful, how it was formed, and how we're going to move these issues forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of this, Sonia. I think it's been really helpful, and
I hope so.
yeah, and really excited to see you on the Hill next week.
Yeah, see you next week. Definitely stop by. We're here in Longworth. Yeah,
Great.
thanks for all you're doing.
Much.